Welcome to DevRelevant. I'm your host, Danny Mulvihill. In this show, we explore tools and topics in the tech scene through the lens of developers, engineers, and DevRels. Welcome to this episode of the DevRelevant Podcast. Today, my guest is Sarah Guthals, PhD, the Director of Developer Relations at Sentry.io, a leading developer tools platform that specializes in transforming what can be the chaos of software development into a more manageable process. Sentry offers a suite of tools that boost your app's performance and stability. Some of the key features are error monitoring, session replay, performance and profiling, even code coverage, all designed to help you, the developer, to quickly find and then fix problems. So, Sarah, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Right on. So let's dig right in. Well, actually, the first thing that comes to mind is I noticed that, and this is maybe not relevant, but I noticed you have PhD in your name, which isn't a common requirement of somebody in developer relations. So maybe tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how you ended up in this role today.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that I love about DevRel is that all of us have such unique backgrounds. It's one of my favorite things about meeting folks in the industry. But I actually started college wanting to be a medical doctor. It was something I wanted to be my whole life. And then I started failing chemistry and realized I'm not quite good at memorizing. I know I believe in growth mindset. Anyone can become good. I just don't want to be good at memorizing.
Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to go into research. Like that's what I wanted to do. So in college, I, was browsing around a little bit and decided on computer science. Had never done it before. It was completely new to me. I'm fairly old. So like even when MySpace was popular, I didn't really know how to customize it without just purely copying and pasting. But I tried it and I absolutely fell in love. And I went to UC San Diego, University of California, San Diego, and the tutor department there, phenomenal. Like just so many other students in the labs at all hours, available, willing, and excited to help you. So I fell in love with just kind of the process of teaching and learning to code. My mom is also a retired teacher, so it probably stems from that too. And yeah, by the time I finished undergrad, I just didn't feel like I was done. I wasn't really done learning. And I had the opportunity to work with some professors as an undergrad on computer science education research. So I basically just stayed. I got an NSF, which is the National Science Foundation here in the States. I got an NSF fellowship, which paid for my education for my graduate work. And I stayed and did research on how you can design software and learning experiences for novices to learn code, not just kind of the syntax or even just like the semantics, but the actual culture around it, like the need to have like persistence through debugging, the skill of Googling, literally, like not necessarily like doing that, but like searching, reading through docs, like understanding that. So I did research on that, and that is really where my DevRel career started. But this was before DevRel was even a thing.
Okay, totally.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for the quick background there. Let's jump into what you're doing at Sentry. And so like I had mentioned, the first half of the podcast, we'll typically talk about the tools and it's targeted towards developers. And then we'll get to dig into some more DevRel topics in the latter half. Yeah. So can you just start by giving listeners an overview of Sentry.io and its core capabilities, beyond what I mentioned in the intro?
Yeah. First of all, you did a great job of kind of giving an overview, but so Sentry is essentially an application monitoring platform tool. We support over 100 languages and frameworks, essentially every programming language you might want to do something with. We likely support it in some way. Even, technically like all of the newest JavaScript frameworks, because we support JavaScript, you can get some support through us. And so a couple things about Sentry that I particularly love as an engineer and as a DevRel person is we do have a self-serve or self-hosted version. So all of our code is on GitHub. It's publicly available, and you can actually just self-host it and run it completely for free. Well, not really free because you have to do all the hosting. But yeah, so you can run it that way. We also have free tiers for developers, and then multiple tiers for larger and larger teams. But that focus on being publicly available source code and kind of having the license to be able to use it for free as a developer was something that really attracted me. We also have all of our SDKs are also on GitHub publicly available. And again, we have SDKs for JavaScript as a whole, but then we have very specific ones, like if you're a Next.js developer,
nice.
We have a specific SDK for that. And when you think about application monitoring, oftentimes people think more so about kind of errors and when, some big bug happens. But we do also have just immense amount of support for performance issues as well. And we're tying things that are both error related and performance related together in one kind of view for you to be able to quickly identify what the actual core issue is and be able to fix it fast. So identify what the core issue is. Okay, your application slows down, alert, or, you get a error message. Fine. Okay, that's fairly simple. But the fix it faster part is the part that I love about Sentry. So we tie all of the Sentry issues that you will see in your dashboard as close to the code that is triggering that issue as possible. And I don't mean like the code that is, calling the exception, right? Or like sure. Implementing the exception. I mean like the actual code that is likely to have been the root cause of that exception.
Right. So for example, like if I can cut you off for a second, one thing that comes to mind is so often when you're trying to search down an error, it's like in the compiled build file and it's this 10,000 line just monster JavaScript file. And you're like, this is so unhelpful. So what are some ways that Sentry helps get around this? Like, can I upload source maps? I think
exactly. Yep. So you can upload source maps. We have GitHub integrations. I was just actually recording a demo video yesterday that shows if there is a likely commit that caused the issue. So not just will we, link to the actual GitHub repo, the actual line of code in your GitHub repo, and you can see that. But we will also link to what we call suspect commit. So the commit that we suspect is the root cause. And then it has the person there. So you can immediately go talk to the person that is likely to be able to fix the problem faster because they are likely to have the context to be able to fix it.
And how do you... is it just like because you have all the application monitoring and you use that to figure out like, well, once this commit went live, things started going nuts?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Nice. Yeah. And so we also have distributed tracing. So we can trace an issue from the front end all the way to, database calls, to server calls, like just all the way through from front end to back end to your database to everything that you're using. And so it's not just kind of, when we made this database call, then the issue was triggered. So maybe it was the adding of the call to the database. Maybe the issue is actually, in the back end code, not in the front end code that makes the initial call to the back end to then call the database. Things like distributed tracing, the source maps, having code owners. So maybe the person who committed the code is not the person who's maintaining the code. So instead, you might want to assign a code owner to a specific portion of your code. GitHub does this already with automatic assignment of issues. So we do the same thing. You can automatically assign Sentry issues to your code owners that are associated on your GitHub repo.
Nice. So they get alerted with the error that's coming up. That's awesome.
Exactly.
For a second there, you're talking, we briefly touched on not just being an error monitoring tool, but helping debug and troubleshoot performance. And one thing that came to mind is, so it's in the development phase where a lot of these performance issues are really trying to be ironed out. And, because you're just like trying to get it work and then you're trying to make it better. And so you're knowingly writing, code that is not performant. How is it? What are some ways that you can use Sentry, for example, to help in the development process rather than like post-production app and like, everything's presumably good? How does it help me in the development process?
Yeah, so we have been working our way kind of earlier in the dev workflow. First of all, with our acquisition of CodeCov about 2 years ago, almost a year and a half ago now, back in 2022, we acquired CodeCov, which is a code coverage tool, so testing, as a kind of start to getting into that development phase when you're kind of what we're calling pre-production, right? And so supporting software like that is one way. Sorry, hang on. Let me just take a sip of water.
Yeah, go for it.
I just got something caught in my throat for a second. Goodness gracious. Okay. Is it gone? There it goes. Okay. So supporting developers earlier in their developer workflow with things like CodeCov in that pre-production phase is somewhere where we have been continuously investing. In addition to that, we've recently released Spotlight, which is essentially Sentry for development. So it's adding kind of a debug toolbar that creates kind of an overlay into your development environments using the Sentry SDKs. And so, it's early in our phases of adding value to that. Let me rephrase that. We're early in our investment in kind of that pre-production workflow for developers, but it is something that we are very much focused on in terms of testing, in terms of kind of debugging while you're in your editor IDE, and then also in terms of when you are opening up PRs on GitHub. So we're continuously adding more information to your GitHub PRs for things that might cause issues in the future, or that might be related to issues that are already happening in your application now.
Nice. And of course, if anybody doesn't know, like you guys have, at least the last time I used Sentry professionally was a couple of years ago. Now I'm not doing software development professionally, so that's why I'm not using it. But just being able to set up different environments so that, and I can set different thresholds. So if I have dev, like it's a mess and I'm not worried and I don't want emails.
Yes.
But it can't, it did help me occasionally. I remember being like, oh, wow, like I didn't even know that was happening, but I got the Sentry alert while I was developing a different part of the app. So
Exactly. Yeah. So we do have the different environments. We also you might have multiple Sentry projects that are related to the same code base, because maybe you have, a mobile app version and a web app version, and you want to be able to kind of monitor what is happening and what issues are arising across all of your, like actual applications, but based off of the same code base.
Cool. So one thing I want to come back to that I didn't know, and I think is pretty amazing, is that you open source the actual Sentry code base. And so I can just freely go download Sentry and run it myself. Is part of the idea here, like you're giving away the tools to be like, so sure, go ahead and do it and like run all these servers. And then when you see how hard it is, like you'll see that you should just use us, or what's kind of the theory there?
I think it's kind of, I think there reaches a point when you like, either you are so small of kind of an operation that it doesn't make sense for you to host things on your own, or you have, you're large enough to where, again, it doesn't make sense to host things on your own. So I think like whether you're self-hosting or you are using kind of a SaaS product, it really kind of depends on your operation, like who you have supporting, where you want to invest your money versus people, which is still, money in the end, but kind of where you want that engineering power to be focused on. But Sentry started open source, David so cool. and team, like they started just because they needed something better that was more targeted towards them as developers. And we just never lost that focus. We really do focus on what developers need. So it's less about kind of, obviously what developers need is working, applications. But it's less about kind of trying to force you into our workflow and more about just making sure that you have the context and the information that you need to be able to fix the bugs faster so you can get on to actually, writing the new features.
Sure.
And this is actually what makes, like, one of the reasons they brought on a DevRel team to Sentry was because it is actually so easy to integrate Sentry into your application. It's like 5 lines of code. You can add additional things. We've got metrics that we track for you, but you can have custom metrics. We have breadcrumbs that we track for you, but you can have custom breadcrumbs. We have, contexts that we track for you, but you can add custom contexts. So, at the bare minimum, 5 lines of code and you're up and running. And most people have some integration set up with Teams or Slack or Discord. So you're really just kind of getting this notification. Oh, there's a bug. We send you directly to your GitHub. You fix it, open a PR, deploy, and you're good. I have a lot of friends who are engineers at large companies where they use Sentry. And when I first started here, they were like, I've never heard of Sentry. And then, 2 weeks later, they're like, oh, wait a minute. That's what we use to monitor our applications. I just didn't realize because it keeps you out of the app so well.
Nice.
And allows you to be actionable on your code so quickly that you don't necessarily, attach yourself to it. So that was kind of a long-winded way of saying we really are just focused on developers and supporting developers. Totally. And so having it be open source isn't just to say, like, look how hard it is. It's actually to say, if that's what suits your operation better, great, do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, another thing that comes to mind, which I think is a really powerful feature, is like the company I work at, CrossMint, we have a lot of businesses using us in the EU, which have much more stringent data protection standards. And so a lot of times we'll come up with stuff where, the client's like, oh, even encrypted stuff, it has to be within the EU. And so I can think of a lot of cases where a project implementing this is like, dude, we cannot be sending all our logs to some SaaS provider. So that's a pretty cool, I think that's a killer feature that it's amazing that somebody could just spin that up, for right off of GitHub.
And speaking of, right? No, I know. Speaking of privacy, that's the other thing. We are hyper vigilant when it comes to privacy, not just for the requirements of operating, in the EU or even in the US, but we've recently removed cookies from all of our sites, which makes attribution for DevRel folks harder, but happily so, right? Like I would rather us not be tracking people across, their multiple sessions, and find other ways to show value in what my team does. So we're really, really hyper focused on just making sure that we aren't collecting any data that isn't necessary. And that shows up both in kind of our marketing and how we do things. I will even sometimes it's important to use short links, and we don't have our own short link creator quite yet. It's a side project I'm working on, but so we use Bitly, and Bitly obviously uses cookies, but we don't mask the Bitly link, because if you're a developer, Bitly uses cookies, so we're not leveraging those cookies. So we show the pure Bitly link, right? Nice. YouTube has cookies on their videos. We make sure that we upload everything to Vimeo if we're going to be embedding a video on our website. So no YouTube videos are embedded on our website, because otherwise you'd get the YouTube Google cookies when you watched it. But it also shows up in our product, right? So session replay is another feature of Sentry where you get a video-like reproduction of what was happening in your user's browser or mobile app when the exception occurred. And we automatically mask pretty much everything. You can actually go in
really
and
good.
unmask things, but so anywhere where there would be an image, where there would be text that a user could put in, where it might have any PII or personally identifiable information, we will automatically mask that. And so it shows up in our product, it shows up in our marketing. We recently announced, this was back in November of 2023, our EU data residency program for that exact problem that you were talking about of keeping your data in the EU if it needs to remain in the EU, but you still want to use the SaaS product. Shoot, I just blanked. There was one last thing I wanted to say. Oh, well.
All right.
but yeah. So there's a hyper focus on making sure that we're not collecting a data that isn't needed to be collected.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I can back that up in my own case. I remember you really do have to opt in to sharing something. Like I was working on an app, and it actually did make sense to log email, because it was like, it was basically the user ID of the person, but I had to tell it to do it.
Yes.
Otherwise it would just automatically like blanking stuff out. So I can definitely back that up.
Awesome.
Let's see here. Going from here, let's talk about, so this is a question I like to ask people like you, is what is a feature, like some advanced feature or kind of unknown thing that Sentry does that you think is just so cool, but you don't think it gets enough love?
Oh, that's a good question. I got to think about that one for a minute. I mean,
well, sometimes the answer is like, no, like the coolest feature is this and people are using it. That's why, we're killing it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are some newer features that have come out or that are coming out that I think are hard for the general developer to kind of immediately grasp, because it does really require kind of a use case that is hyper relevant to you. So one of those features is our metrics, where you can capture automatically certain metrics, but also have custom metrics that you want to be tracking across the use of your application that helps you identify the health, the usage, without having like all of these cookies. It's not about tracking individual users, but rather about understanding like, okay, how often is this, library being called, or how quickly is this data being retrieved? Am I improving that over time, or is it causing, is it stagnant? Is it something that we need to prioritize? I think just kind of that type of feature. It's not the only one we have. We have a lot of these ways that you can optimize your usage of Sentry that really allow you to really decide what is the priority thing that your developers should be focused on to improve the experience for your users. And kind of tying in the general monitoring for errors and performance with what is actually happening when your users are using your application. And then what is your priority list when it comes to your engineering teams? That is something that I don't know that people fully appreciate, that we try to focus on. It's not just this big list of errors that then you need a PM to kind of siphon through, right? And another example of that is our user feedback widget. We recently launched kind of this ability to add in a small widget where if the user is experiencing some kind of issue that doesn't result in an actual exception, but is a problem, you want that feedback. And you don't necessarily want them just kind of yelling at you on Twitter or sharing, or opening a bunch of support tickets, because it actually is an error. It's just not showing up in the code. So it's, and I've experienced this so often. One example is I like to track my exercise on my watch. And one of the exercises I do every day is I walk my dogs or run my dogs. And every time I open the exercise app on my watch, I now know I have to wait about 5 seconds because something else is going to pop up in front of it. And so I can't, if I click immediately on the top exercise, which is outdoor walk for me, because it's the most recent one, it'll accidentally click on the pop-up version of whatever it is. Exactly. And it used to frustrate me a ton because I'd accidentally go in there and then I'd have to go back, and I hate using the small screen on my watch. But then I just learned, okay, I just got to wait. I wish I could give that feedback somehow. But other than like writing an email someone will never see, or just ranting about it on Twitter, which I don't like to do, I don't have an effective way of giving that feedback. And so this like user feedback widget is an example of like when that would be useful.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's nice. And somewhat related to that, like in my own experience, it's more that what shocked me when I first came across Sentry was the fact that I could capture client-side errors and then send them to me instead of like getting an error report and being like, okay, can you press Command-Shift-J and now look, okay, where's it at? Oh, okay, look for the 3 dots and then move it to the right side. Okay. And trying to talk through some random person, like, it's ridiculous. And instead of that, you can just see it and even like get you guys call it session replay. So powerful. It's crazy.
Oh my gosh.
How much
they're so pretty too. Like you could just really see it. You can watch it happening. You can trace what's happening while the video reproduction is happening. It really looks like we took a video, screencast of the customer, even though that's not what we're doing. It's just a DOM recreation. But like it is amazing. And there's so much information you can gather. There was one example where a customer had identified an issue, and it was actually an issue with a pop-up of an extension in their browser and had nothing to do with their application. Wow. Yeah. So they were getting all of these like, oh, it looks like we're having this like performance issue or something like that. And it really had nothing. So they were able to completely dismiss that. And all they had to do is watch like a 30-second session replay video instead of going down this huge rabbit hole and wasting engineers' time just to find out it had nothing to do with them.
Yeah, definitely. That's so cool. All right. Let's, one thing that kind of came up as I was preparing for this conversation is AI is obviously a huge thing right now. Like it's going nuts, and it has been, for a little while now. But I'm curious if that's on Sentry's radar at all of finding some way to integrate these types of tools into the developer tooling.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you're not thinking about how AI can help you, you're doing a disservice to your product and your customers. But as I mentioned, we are hyper vigilant about, privacy and making sure that everything that we offer is actionable for developers and not just kind of extra noise. Mm-hmm. So we do have engineers who are really thinking about that. You'll actually see some of it show up in the app now. We're adding in additional kind of I would call it educational content to issues. So on issues, for example, if you have an N+1 error with like a Django app, we will have like a small section. It doesn't take a lot of real estate underneath your kind of main error information on the issue page that says, hey, if you're wondering a little bit more about how to capture N+1 or resolve N+1 issues, here's some docs, or here's a blog post or whatever it might be. And then in addition to that, we're leveraging kind of AI. So you'll sometimes see like a little box on an issue page that says, like, AI hasn't found anything that might be useful for you this time because it is still fairly new. But yeah, so there are some new features that are coming out, but we are being kind of careful about how we integrate it. Because again, we want to make sure that we're not like sharing any private information with any kind of, learning model. And we also want to make sure that we're not just adding noise to an already complex kind of dashboard.
Yeah, no kidding. That's cool. Is there anything else in the realm of, like how Sentry helps developers that maybe we didn't discuss that you think we should have brought up that we want to make sure people know about?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is, we talked a little bit about how our code is available on GitHub publicly. There's a huge discourse right now online about the word open source and whether some softwares should be considered open source. Are you talking capital O, capital S open source or lowercase, all of this discussion. I don't want to get into that necessarily now, but one thing that we did try to do, or we are doing, is we launched a new license for code called the functional source license. And it's essentially we found that none of the existing licenses really matched what we were trying to accomplish with having our code be publicly available to any developer. So if you go to FSL for functional software license, so fsl.software, you can see the license there. And we have discussions about it fairly often. And we actually have a GitHub repo with other folks who are using FSL. And a little bit of a FAQ. So we're constantly working on kind of improving that and the language around it. But Chad Whitaker, who's our open source program officer, he is doing an incredible job of just kind of like leading this effort to contribute back to the developer community that is beyond just helping developers through the tool.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool. What would you say is like a key feature contrasting it with some of the other more common software licenses?
Yeah, it's really, I think it just kind of is speaking to, and please go read all of the details because we're,
Totally.
it is iterating over time. So don't just take my word for this, but it is really focused on kind of the use case of Sentry, which is we want developers to be able to use Sentry freely and host it themselves if that's the way that they choose to use it. We don't want to limit folks in doing that. However, we are also a company with employees and with costs. And if we're going to continue to be successful, we also don't want someone to take it, put a new logo on it and say, here is a competitor, right? Which is fair, I think. And so it's really, really just about that. It's about the nature of like, look, we want to make sure that you can, what I believe, and I'm a former like hubber from pre-Microsoft acquisition and what I believe open source is about, which is the sharing of information, the freely available, code source to be able to use in smaller projects or even in larger, companies, and kind of continuing to push engineering. And if we're all hiding everything that we're doing, we're all going to be reinventing the wheel every time, and it just doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. So that's the nature of it. And then, but understanding that we also live in capitalism. So we need to have some kind of, rules and regulations around that. So that's really what it's kind of about is trying to stay true to that nature of like contributing back to the community, basically.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely going to check it out. I already got a few tabs open to understand it better. Because software license, it's always like one of those, it's a bit of an afterthought, in like the early stage development, you're like, whatever, I'll figure that out. But it's good to know that there's something worth looking into.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, then that kind of wraps up like this, what we'll call the first section. And we'll see like, if this concept holds. But for now, that's what we're going to do. So, we covered a lot about how Sentry can help developers, not just in the early process. It sounds like you guys are investing more in that part of the software development lifecycle, but especially when we are in production and working on teams, and you just need to know what is going on with applications. Hopefully, cut down on 2 a.m. pages and catch issues during the day or during the working hours, things like that. Yeah. So, thank you for sharing all of that information. That's been really fun.
Yeah, definitely.
And now let's dive into how Sentry approaches developer relations. I'm obviously quite excited about this. I think it's such a fun role because you get to still lean on like a technical background that you spent years developing and building. But, to that last comment, I don't get paged at 2 a.m. anymore. Nobody's going to wake me up if like something's missing on the docs. Like that can definitely wait till tomorrow. And I really love that. So In your role as the director of developer relations at Sentry, how do you approach building a community around Sentry, the product?
Yeah. So the DevRel team at Sentry is fairly small, as I think most DevRel teams are at a company this size. We've got myself and 3 other engineers who are just great at creating content and explaining and teaching. And so, 4 of us plus over 100 languages and frameworks that we support.
Wow. That's kind of crazy.
Right. So exactly. So it's not possible for us to be, present in every single community or grow a community that would be relevant to every single developer with just such a small team. So we do, one thing that I appreciate about being DevRel here at Sentry is that we have a number of other teams that support some of the other activities that sometimes will fall under DevRel, but don't for us. So we've got an incredible support team. Nice. So any support tickets, we're not, handling those. We have a phenomenal solutions engineering team. And they're typically the ones that are going to conferences, that are boothing the conferences, that are on customer calls when customers are having, major issues. That are beyond kind of a support ticket. We also have an incredible product marketing team, and they create the majority of the content around new features and kind of announcements and things like that. So that allows my team to focus on what are the conferences where it makes sense for us to be creating a high touch point with members of that community? What are the conferences where it makes sense for us to be giving a highly technical talk around an aspect that is relevant for that technical community that highlights what Sentry does well? And it allows us to focus on just what are folks, developers, struggling with, regardless of monitoring, just what are the challenges they're facing? And then is there an opportunity for Sentry to support, or easing those challenges? And so I think that it creates a really authentic experience for us as advocates to focus on, okay, let's build an application. Let's see where we're struggling. Let's listen to other people who are building applications and understand kind of what are the biggest challenges for Next.js developers today, and how can we bring that information back to the team, and how can we support those developers, even if Sentry is a minor or sometimes non-existent part of that. So a lot of the content that we create is around challenges developers are facing, not around how can you use Sentry to resolve this.
Sure.
And when it comes to creating community, we do that in a number of ways. I mentioned kind of going to conferences, focusing kind of on particular content. But another way is partnering with folks who already have kind of the ear of the community. And it's not just in kind of paid sponsorships. We definitely do that. We sponsor a lot of podcasts, a lot of YouTube channels, things like that. But rather in like a true partnership. So one example of that is James Quick is a DevRel advocate who does stuff on his own now. And we are partnering with him. He's building an application over the course of 6 months. And Sentry is going to be the monitoring tool that he uses for that application. But other than that, he's just building the application and he's reaching his community of developers. And every once in a while, he'll mention I'm able to do this because Sentry is helping to sponsor this.
Totally.
Right. And so when he mentions Sentry, it is authentically, it is not just an ad read. Right. It is, oh my God, I'm so glad I'm using Sentry because they just alerted me to this performance issue that would have totally, taken down my site or something like that. And again, it kind of goes back to Sentry as a product, really focusing on why is our code still openly available? It's not just to say, oh, you should come, use the SaaS product because it's hard to self-host, but rather to say, hey, you're authentically trying to do something. Let us support you in doing that. That's the same way we partner with these developers who have large communities, as we say, hey, you're doing great stuff. How can we support you in doing that?
Yeah.
And you can see that with our acquisition of Syntax, right? The Syntax podcast is a podcast we were sponsoring for so long.
Oh, cool.
And we just loved the content. The content that they were producing, both in their courses and in their podcast episodes, in their just engagement with the community. And so we were like, how can we help you continue to do this?
Awesome.
And the easiest way was to just pay them to work for us, and they still run completely independendly.
Yeah.
Because the goal is not to get them to just talk about Sentry. The goal is to get them to continue to do what they're doing.
Sure. Well, and as long
so that's
as
kind of
like
what community is.
Developers, then, like when you're a developer tools company,
exactly.
More developers is a big part of the answer.
Exactly. So when it comes to community, it's less about trying to grow our own community and more about trying to improve the health of developer communities as a whole, and finding interesting ways to do that.
Cool. I like that. You had mentioned also, being careful and choosy about the conferences that you do send the small DevRel team to. Now I'm super curious. Yeah. What are a couple that you've identified that you feel are like really worth sending some people to?
Yeah, that's a great question. This kind of depends.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on a couple of things. So number one, I don't believe in, like I said, we've got a fairly small team, and we can't all be experts in everything, but we all do have expertise in some things. Mm-hmm. And so I take that into consideration. What might Salma be interested in speaking about? And where are the folks who, comprise her community more likely to attend as well? Mm-hmm. So that's part of the equation. Another part is, where is our product? Where are we strongest in our product? Where are we weakest in our product? Where do we want to get? For us, it's not about the sales. For us, it's about kind of the feedback. It's about the understanding of how folks within that community might leverage Sentry, or where are they having problems with Sentry that we might be able to bring that information back to the product teams. So that gets taken into consideration. And then every quarter, which it doesn't change every quarter, but every quarter we evaluate and decide on 5 top communities that we want to focus on. Mm-hmm. And those are going to be the communities where we will create the majority of the content coming from our team. But we may still also be creating content outside of that and partnering with folks to create content outside of that. So recently, a lot of them have been React based. Mm-hmm. It's a huge developer community. It kind of makes sense to be. So there was a few conferences, a few React days around the world, that we sponsor and that we like to attend and submit submit talks to. One that I'm very sad that I missed was that conference that just happened in Texas. I was slated to go, we sponsored, and then I got sick the day before I was supposed to leave. Man. And I was so mad, but I didn't want to get anyone else sick. So I just skipped out. But that, less about kind of a particular technical community and more about kind of the community at large, would be an example of that one.
Okay.
So yeah, there's been a couple like that. I'm trying to think of ones that we're submitting to recently. Something I really like to do is look at kind of the smaller ones. Sure. So there's a smaller one in Seattle called Cascadia JS that I'm looking forward to attending this year, and just kind of identifying those smaller groups of. It's still a fairly large conference, but not as big as some of these. Sure. And those smaller conferences, I feel like, are the ones where you get really high quality conversations happening. Yeah. The hallway track is just great. And the talks tend to be less salesy and more like, this is what happened, more like dog fooding or trial and error. ViewConf was one that we attended last year in Toronto, ViewConf Toronto, that I felt was that way as well. It was like fairly small. The talks were just incredible. And we had great conversations with folks. So
nice. Cool. Thanks for sharing some of your research on this.
Yeah, for sure.
So you've already kind of covered, really the top level strategy that you guys have, which if I could sum it up, sounds like just being authentically interested in the success of developers. And so whatever way you can try to achieve that outcome is sort of like how you approach building community around not just Sentry, but the developer community more broadly. And let's see, what about, so have you personally faced any challenges? Like, so let's start here. How long, when did you join the DevRel team at Sentry?
It's almost been 2 years. I think like a year and 9 or 10 months.
Nice.
Something like
Congratulations coming up.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And were you doing DevRel or anything like that prior, or were you still finishing your postgrad degrees?
Yeah. So I graduated about 15 years ago. It's been way too long. Yeah. So out of school, after my PhD work, I ran a small company where we taught kids to code. And then we also taught teachers how to teach kids to code. So I did that for a couple years. And then I joined GitHub, first as a contractor, building a GitHub for kids under 13, which was so much fun. I built a prototype. This was prior to the acquisition. And I obviously didn't know about the acquisition because I was just a contractor. Yeah. Hot tip, if you're going to be going through an acquisition, don't start a product targeting children on the internet because the legalities around it is so complicated. Yeah. So we definitely had to stop that project because, they started having those conversations. So after stopping that project, I actually joined GitHub as an engineering manager for the editor tools team. And we were building the integration of GitHub into VS Code, Visual Studio, Unity, and Atom. And that, I feel like I've just always been in love with developer tools. Mm-hmm. But that was one of the roles where I really, really just fell in love with this idea of how can we build better tools for developers to be able to build better applications, basically. Right. And then after GitHub was acquired by Microsoft, I switched over to Microsoft to be an advocate because I had never formally done advocacy. And by that point, it was starting to become a thing. Mm-hmm. So I joined Microsoft and stayed there for a few years as an advocate and then Sentry.
Nice. Okay, cool. So with all of that background, that's kind of leading towards when you really dove into advocacy, did you feel like you had any challenges or what was something that you struggled to figure out as a new developer advocate?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I was lucky enough to where the activities, my deliverables, were something that were kind of within my wheelhouse based off of just my experience. Like I said, my PhD work, my startup, all was essentially advocacy. It just didn't have that title. I was already, writing tutorials, creating videos, creating courses, writing books, things like that. So that type of work specifically was luckily within my wheelhouse. Definitely constantly improving on that as both kind of technology improves, what I'm focused on changes, and as just kind of the communities and what they're looking for changes. But I think one of the hardest parts for anyone in DevRel, whether you are part of a company or you're doing this on your own, is really demonstrating the ROI of the work that you're doing. Because if you're doing it right, you're not selling.
Yeah.
But, and I think Tessa just released a blog post about this, you are, right? Of course you're selling. If you're working for a company, of course, every single person at the company should be thinking about, or maybe not necessarily actively thinking, but if your company doesn't do well in sales, you will not have a job anymore. Yeah, totally. That's just, and not because it's your fault, but just because the company won't exist anymore. Right. So every single person is contributing to that in some way. Right. And if you're doing it on your own, you're still selling. You're selling sometimes yourself. You're selling kind of your expertise and whether people should be listening to you. You're selling kind of your point of view and trying to get people to kind of see it in one way or to engage with you. So that I think is a challenge, because it is a constant balance of authenticity, like capitalism, and then just like how people learn and how people engage. And depending on the company you're at, the goals of that company, the goals of your team, the product that you're working with, that can look very, very different. So that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that I don't think that there's an answer to. I mean, many, many, many people have written about it and kind of talked about it, but there isn't a one size fits all answer. It's kind of like parenting. It's like, there can be advice. Some things might work for you, but it really depends on who you are, who your customers are, and, the situation that, like, the time that we live in.
Yeah, I was really going to try to push you on like, but what's one way you can measure ROI? And then the parenting analogy really resonates, because like what I always tell like friends that are about to become parents is like, it will be hard, and all you really have to do is always try and always love them. And so as long as you're like always authentically trying to do the right developer relation initiative and you love the product, like it'll work. And hopefully you'll notice before they're 25, like, and they're just not yelling at you all the time or thinking you're the worst. I'm like, I mean, I hope you have great friends with great parents, but like, I also kind of hope you realize how great we are someday.
Right.
By contrast. Okay. Back to the professional stuff.
No, but it's true. And so, I mean, I think there are ways that you can have ROI. I mean, I think, again, with Sentry, it's become even harder because we don't have cookies. And so we're not tracking. If you watch one of our videos,
we don't know.
I don't know if that then led to, you signing up, because we're not tracking you that way. But the way that we do is by trying to add value. So if we, there are traditional marketing campaigns and efforts that we have, if we can add value to those, that to me is an ROI. So a concrete example of this is Sentry likes to offer live workshops that are virtual for developers. And so typically what we do is we have an engineer who is kind of explaining how you might leverage this tool. They'll show an actual working app. They'll dive into the code, and everyone watching can ask questions. We're, sharing, this is what would happen if you're stuck with this challenge or what have you. They're really high engaged workshops. And what we used to do is record those workshops, and then within 24 hours, we'd get those workshops posted to YouTube, and then we would send a follow-up email to folks who attended the workshop and was like, here's the recording, and here's some additional material if that's useful. If you get an email 24 hours after a workshop, you're not likely going to open it. I mean, like there are some people who do, but it's less likely that folks will open it, right? So, and running a workshop is a lot of effort, right? Like doing a live technical demo essentially and taking live questions, like it is a lot of effort. In addition to prepping that demo, right? So we were brainstorming, like, how can we improve this whole thing for both like the customers, the marketing team, and DevRel's time and expertise. And so one way that we did that was we pre-recorded a high quality, well-produced video series on how to leverage Sentry to monitor Next.js applications. We got it ready to be published at the time of the workshop, so not before. When people showed up to the workshop, we did a slightly higher level presentation on that, where it wasn't just a presentation. It was like, okay, we just launched this video series. We will send it to you. Here's the link to it, but also we'll send it to you right after this workshop so that you can go watch it. And then we said, we're going to go through it right now with you though. And we had snippets. I didn't have to have VS Code open because then you're wasting time with like, oh, this didn't compile right. Oh, I just had I just had like snippets from the recording that I had already done. And we had just such a rich conversation. I think that session, we had our highest attendance rate and our highest like number of comments happening and questions happening during the workshop. So we had just like a very rich conversation with everyone who attended. And then we were able to send the email to them the second the workshop ended.
Wow,
it was done, hit send, and we were able to send the additional content. And we got so many more people interested in signing up, interested in demos, actually just signing up from that whole process than we have in previous workshops. So that was just kind of like an example of how you can, even if you're not having some sales quota, you can still have a high touch point or like a tight connection with other orgs within the company that do have track that and just add value to it in a way that resonates with developers more authentically and more technically and doesn't feel so much like it's just, the marketing department trying to sell to you.
Right, for sure. Yeah, that's good. And thanks for sharing an actual concrete example. Super cool.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's see. From here, I think let's talk a little bit about. So one thing that's been on my mind is like we need to add a DevRel person to my team, but I really want them to be technically strong because I think that's what makes me good at the role and the type of stuff that we're trying to do within our company. It just makes more sense. We have people focused on marketing, similar to you and stuff. So I'm curious how you think about and how you'd maybe even encourage others to go about finding these type of candidates. And do you, like, if you have help in the hiring process, are you open to like trying to convert a software engineer to a DevRel, or I'll just kind of like leave all of that out there for you and let you take what is interesting.
Yeah. So funnily enough, Lazar Nikolov, who is the first person to join my team after I joined, this is his first advocacy role. He was a software engineer completely before that. So I think like that conversion of software engineer to advocate is definitely possible. I think it really depends on what your team needs in terms of the deliverables and what space you have for like mentoring or guiding or managing folks who may be lacking in certain areas. So if what you're really looking for is someone who is, highly connected within the community, then you do have to start looking at things like how many followers do they have? It's not about vanity metrics. It's about what is their reach of their voice, right? Like how many views are their videos getting? How many subscribers do they have on YouTube or on Twitch or whatever platform you're thinking of engaging with your community on? That reputation can't be done overnight, right? So if you're looking for someone who has that reputation, who can immediately like reach an audience that you care about, then you need to look at that. When you do look at that though, I think it is very important that you recognize that they built that reputation on themselves and that you can't just commandeer that for your totally. Company, right? So I actually even have on my DevRel Notion page, like a section on social media that says, while advocates are encouraged to reshare Sentry's posts, it is not a requirement to fill our, social media profiles with just a bunch of retweets or whatever it might be. So I think that comes with its own caveats. I think for me personally, I think having folks who are very technically sound is important. For the size of our team today and for the product that we're focused on, I need people who can jump into PHP, even though they've never written a line of PHP, figure it out, write a sample application, and write a blog post about it, right? I need someone who I can trust to be able to do that. And if you aren't an expert in at least one language and have had like production level experience in at least one language, you're not going to be able to effectively do that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's important to me. I think then it also comes down to the other types of content, right? The writing, the videos, things like that. And I think writing is the easiest to kind of mentor through, because it can be done asynchronously.
Yeah.
But video, that's not something that is easily taught,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not something that people necessarily have the like setup that I had. I've got like my camera, it's a Sony
Mm-hmm.
camera that's on a tripod with a thing for if I want to do like teleprompting.
Uh-huh.
I've got this like giant light shining right on my face,
Totally.
and my setup's not even perfect because it's been going through iterations, right? But like, this is not necessarily easy. Knowing when you are recording, how to like pause and not scroll so that you don't cause a lot of problems with editing. Like, there's a lot of skills that people don't realize go behind this type of thing. So I think what's important is recognizing what are the highest priority skills that you need in filling the gaps of your team, and not trying to just find someone who's like you, because you are already there.
For
right?
sure.
So it's hard. It is not easy. And I worked very closely with my recruiting team to find Lazar and Salma. And I am so happy with the team right now. We also have Tom, who came over through the CodeCov acquisition. Absolutely phenomenal. I would have chosen him if it was a choice.
Sure.
And I'm so happy he got to kind of join in on our team, because we each just have different expertise in different areas, and we create a really well-rounded team.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing. So then I think we're getting close to wrapping up, but one last question, because this has been on my mind a little bit, is from your perspective, what are the aspects of DevRel that you'd kind of call table stakes? Like, you have to have these things taken care of before you get really excited about going to all the conferences and stuff.
That's a great question. I think anyone on the team should be able to, without too much effort, write or create a video or create a piece of content, let's say, about the product, but mentioning kind of like an authentic example. I think too often we have these like hello world examples that demonstrate the product, but don't speak to a real world scenario where that would actually happen or the product would actually be useful. And that's just, it might resonate. It really depends on kind of what the product is. In some cases that might resonate. At Sentry, it won't. Like, like if you don't have a production level application, it's not super helpful. So we found ways to kind of go in the middle, so we don't have to like run a separate product as the DevRel team. But I do think like, before you're just kind of going off and starting shows or attending all the conferences, you need to be able to speak to the product and how folks will authentically use that product and to solve real problems, and not just spout kind of the sales, scenarios. But focus on kind of, I understand that you are, a Python developer, and this is the issue that you are likely going to be facing. Tell me more about your specific scenario, and I can help tell you like how I would solve that as an engineer, and then leveraging the product that I'm, advocating for. So we do that by starting with typically like blog posts. It's so much easier to do research, to get feedback, to, share that with a bunch of other engineers or other advocates, or even the marketing and sales teams, like kind of get a sense of like, okay, we're all on the same page. This is how we talk about this challenge that developers are facing. This is how we, advocate for the product or demonstrate its ability to support developers. And then we can create really fun and engaging and additional content or talks or things like that around it. So when it comes to table stakes, I think it's really that is like, can you without a ton of effort, write something that would authentically speak to developers that doesn't feel just like a sales pitch. And if you can do that on a couple of different topics, then I think you're golden.
Nice. And so in your answer, are you kind of thinking like on a per person basis, like a person should be able to do this fundamentally, and then they're ready to expand and go beyond that?
I think so. And again, it doesn't have to be written. It could be, someone's more of a video person or more of a give a talk person. That's fine. But yeah, I think each person should be able to do that in some way. The way that we've split up on our team is we've tried a few different iterations, but Salma focuses mostly on errors, Lazad on performance, myself on session replay, and then Tom on pre-production /testing /code cov. And so each of us are more experts in those areas. I know that if I have a question related to any of the other ones, I don't have to go learn it myself necessarily. I can just go ask them, and they can kind of step in and help me. But then I just know that if there's ever a question from anyone, there's someone on my team who has the expertise to be able to kind of answer it.
Definitely. I think one thing you hit on there that really struck a chord with me is balancing simplicity and complexity in a demo application, because you want it to be, especially if it's going to be a repository that you're going to share, simple enough that like a relatively new developer can pick it up, or even that like a lot of times how I'll work on like quick starts is I'll actually build a really small app, but then I'm like showing code samples, in the docs. And I don't want them to get so long with like 3 lines of Tailwind classes just so that, and then like the other thing that comes to mind is every time I'm like, okay, I really got to start writing software tests. And then I look at like some software test tutorials. I'm like, why the fuck would I write a test? Like, that is so dumb, and like, I'm yet to find like a compelling example. I mean, I know tests are valuable and we use them extensively, but personally, I just so rarely come across an example that makes any sense to implement.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, let's monitor this here. Let me just, put the error in. And, we are guilty of that too. But like, again, it kind of depends on what you're trying to give an example of. But when I give like an overall example, sometimes I'll just be like, okay, I'm going to comment out this thing and pretend like it's an actual error, right? And I'm okay with that sometimes, but like it is so frustrating. So my team is actually building an application so that we can kind of go through the process a little bit more. And now that we have kind of a full team, we can do so together and kind of not lose our engineering and things like that too. But it's definitely a challenge. And I think that is the one piece of criticism I always have anytime I'm reviewing any piece of content is like, I really focus on what is that technical example you're using? Because if no one can relate to it, why did you write this in the first place? Like it's not useful.
And on the flip side, like if you can come up with a compelling example, you can get somebody really excited. Like, oh, okay. Like I get it. I want to use that now.
Yep. Exactly.
Awesome. Okay.
It's a challenge.
Yeah. That's why we get paid to do it.
Yep.
Well, that mostly wraps up our time. Is there anything like, this is really just your opportunity, anything that you'd hoped we'd cover that you want to say or share? And finally, like how can people find you and Sentry if they want to, use the product better?
Yeah, definitely. No, I don't think there's really anything else. I'm excited to see the future landscape of DevRel in general, both how DevRel shows up in companies and how folks are kind of launching things on their own and doing things on their own. I think it's a really exciting time to kind of see how that will transform. So particularly excited about that. You can find me pretty much on any social platform. I'm Dr. Guthals. Nice. DR, like the PhD, and then Guthals. For Sentry, we're pretty much get Sentry on every platform. We are always posting on kind of social media. You can also just go to sentry.io and reach out to us. And we are always monitoring our social platforms. If you have questions, a lot of our engineers, even our CTO and founder, David Kramer will be up there and answering questions. So we really do care about the community and kind of developers and your perspective. So don't hesitate to reach out to me individually or to the company.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time and sharing your experience today, Sarah.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.